¿Qué lo que, y'all? What's good? Estamos activos. Bienvenido. And we are at 7,800 suscriptores. So big shout out to all y'all that are already subscribed. And if you ain't yet, come on. In the last lesson, we learned the basics of Spanish noun gender and articles, as well as how to say the and a in Spanish. So those things are going to be super important to know before you start this lesson. So if you haven't seen that video, back it up to that one and then come back to this one when you're done. Because in this lesson, we're going to be learning the different rules that'll help you figure out if a noun is masculine or feminine. So let me just warn you, there are a handful of nouns that don't follow these rules, and I'm going to go over those at the end of this video. But these guidelines will help you get a noun's gender right the majority of the time. So don't stress out about these. This is just meant to be a study guide for you to learn these over time. So don't feel like you just have to memorize these all overnight. It's going to take some time and some practice to get used to it. One more thing to keep in mind, all of these rules apply to non-living things. So in the next and final lesson, I'm going to tell you how to refer to people and animals. So how do you know if a noun is masculine or feminine? Let's start with the feminine noun rules because they're the easiest since there's 3. And we'll start with the easiest one. If a noun ends with sion, then it's feminine. La canción, la televisión. Easy peasy. If a word ends with de, it's feminine. La pared, la ciudad, la actitud. And the last feminine rule, if a word ends with a, it's usually gonna be feminine. So, la computadora, la mesa, la silla. This is probably true 99% of the time, but there are a couple of exceptions that we're going to go over at the end. So those are all pretty simple. Now for the masculine noun gender rules, we'll start with the most popular one. If a noun ends in o, it is typically masculine. So el libro, el diccionario. Again, this is probably true 99% of the time, but there are a couple exceptions that we're going to go over at the end. For the rest of the masculine rules, if it ends in R, L, N, or S, then it's masculine. And I'm going to have to read off these examples because my memory ain't that good. So like el motor, el par, el papel, el pastel, el jardín, el jabón, el capitán, el país, and el mes. Now with ese, that only applies to nouns that naturally have an S at the end in its singular form. So if a noun is feminine and you just add an S to the end to make it plural, it doesn't just suddenly become masculine. So for instance, la mesa, if you make it plural, it's still going to be las mesas. It'll still be feminine. It doesn't just change because you added an S. So the example that I gave, el mes, that already naturally has an S at the end. So it's masculine. Okay, so for the most part, those rules have all been pretty straightforward. But these next 3, With these last 3, you pretty much have to just memorize them as you see them because it could go either way. Fortunately, this only applies to nouns with these 3 endings: e, zeta, and son. With e, it could be el puente, el presente, or it could be la clase, la sangre. With zeta, it's la luz, but el lápiz. And with son, it's el corazón, but la razón. So just do your best with these until you learn otherwise. Those are all the Spanish noun gender rules. So now let's get into the 3 exceptions to these el and la rules that confuse literally everybody. So let's just start with agua. The confusion is that agua ends in a, but it's el agua. And the reason for this actually makes a lot of sense. The stress in agua falls on the first syllable. So it's agua, not agua. And this is important because when you have la before agua, the double A's back to back make it hard to hear the difference between the first syllable in agua and that last part of la. So then it just becomes lagua. So to make it clearer and easier to understand, it's changed to el agua. But agua is still feminine. So if you make it plural, it's going to be las aguas. That's because the S in between la and aguas makes it so that that problem doesn't exist anymore. Now you can clearly hear the difference between las aguas. This is true for other words like águila, el águila, las águilas, Yo soy aguilucho, desde chiquitito. And other words that start with a and specifically have emphasis on the first syllable. But this does not apply to words like la almohada, because although it starts with a, the emphasis is on the third syllable instead of the first syllable. Almohada. So you can clearly hear the difference between la and almohada. Now let's look at la mano. This is another confusing one that, honestly, you just have to memorize. But the simplest explanation is that mano comes from the Latin word manus, so it abides by those rules. This is true for many nouns that come from other languages, including Greek, which is why this exception also includes nouns that end with ma. As a matter of fact, nouns that end in ma, pa, or ta are often masculine, and I call these the mapatas to make them easier to remember. So with these, even though they end in a, they're often masculine, at least in their singular form. El problema, el mapa, el planeta. And for the last exception, words that are abbreviated forms of a longer word keep the original gender. So, por ejemplo, la foto. Foto is short for fotografía, which you can see is feminine. So it's still la foto. The same is true for la moto, which is la motocicleta, la bici, la bicicleta, la tele, la televisión, y muchos más. So I recognize that that probably feels like a lot. So honestly, if you are a beginner, like just at the beginning of your journey, then you can get by just focusing on those 3 feminine rules and then just calling everything else masculine, because you'll still get it right a good chunk of the time. But if you're a little bit more advanced or you want to really focus on getting these things right from the beginning, then I would suggest studying these rules, practicing these rules, and then actually making sure that you're using them and speaking them so that they stick. Because with these, because it takes so much time to get used to, you really do need to be practicing them and speaking them out loud for it to click. In the next and final lesson in this Spanish gender series, we're going to go over how to use articles and gender to talk about living beings. And then after that, we'll wrap up the series with a practice session so you can apply everything that we've learned in this series. So, suscríbete, give this video a like, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Gracias por estar aquí. Hasta la próxima.